The envelope was already open when Maren set it on the kitchen table. Not torn. Not slid loose with a finger. Open the way a thing gets when it's been handled so many times the glue simply gave up. The paper inside was stiff with age, creased in thirds, and she'd read it so often she could have spoken the words without unfolding it. But she unfolded it anyway, there in the gray 4 o'clock light of an October morning, and she smoothed the letter flat against the table the way you smooth a blanket over someone sleeping. The gold medal was still in her coat pocket. Small and heavier than it looked. She'd carried it home from Sacramento that way, not in the velvet box they'd given her, not in her bag, but pressed against her ribs in the left inside pocket of her Carhartt, the way you carry something you're afraid might disappear if you let it out of reach. And now the letter was on the table, and the medal was in her pocket, and outside the first thin light was beginning to find the ridgeline of the orchard, the old trees going dark orange and amber in the early frost, and Maren Calloway set both her hands flat on the table beside the letter and breathed. Because there was a name on that letter. Written in a county extension agent's hand, 22 years ago, in the particular ink blue of a bureaucrat who has never once doubted himself. The name was hers. And what came after the name was not something she had forgotten. You learn a certain kind of patience when you raise apples in the mountains of Dorado County. The trees don't hurry. The seasons don't negotiate. And the people who told Maren Calloway she was throwing her life away on 90 acres of dead wood and rocky California hillside, they didn't hurry either, when it came to being wrong. They took their time about it. They made sure she felt every year of the waiting. This is a story about what gets planted in the dark. Maren was 41 years old the autumn she signed the foreclosure papers on the Halverson property. She had been a pastry chef for 16 years, working restaurants in Placerville and once, briefly, in San Francisco, long enough to know she didn't belong in any kitchen that didn't have a window looking out on something growing. She drove a truck that had 160,000 miles on it and a crack in the windshield she'd been meaning to fix since the second Bush administration. She had savings that amounted to $43,000, every cent of it earned in portions and preserved in portions, the way a woman saves who knows that nobody is going to save her. The Halverson orchard had been abandoned for 11 years by the time the bank put it up. Cal Halverson had planted it in the 1950s, Cox's orange pippins and Gravensteins and a block of something the old county records called simply heirloom seedling, origin unknown, and when Cal died and his son moved to Sacramento and decided that apples were not his inheritance, the orchard went to weeds and deer and the slow quiet rot of untended things. Maren had driven past it for years. Once, she'd stopped and walked the fence line, pressing her face between the wooden rails to look at the trees. They were in poor shape, most of them, lichen-covered, crossing branches, some leaning badly from years of wind and neglect. But they were alive. Under that neglect, underneath the volunteer blackberry that had grown up between the rows, the root systems were deep and old and stubborn, and a person who knew what to look for could see that. Maren knew what to look for. She had not always known. She'd spent 3 winters teaching herself, driving to the UC Cooperative Extension office in Placerville with notebooks full of questions, sitting in the library in Diamond Springs with books on pomology and fermentation chemistry spread open on the table in front of her until the librarian began setting aside volumes she thought Maren might want. She had visited every small cider producer she could find in the Sierra Nevada foothills, asked questions, made notes, asked more questions, and once drove all the way to Vermont just to walk the rows of a heritage apple orchard and talk to the man who managed it about the disease pressure of heirloom varieties at altitude. By the time she signed those foreclosure papers, she had 4 years of preparation behind her. 4 years of reading and visiting and planning and learning the particular grammar of an apple trees needs the way you learn a language, not just the vocabulary but the rhythm of it, the logic underneath. The bank officer who handled the sale was a man named Douglas Farwell. He shook her hand across his desk with a smile that was trying very hard to be encouraging. He asked her what her plan was. She told him. The smile stayed in place, but something behind it shifted. He asked if she had any agricultural experience. She told him she'd been studying the property and the region for 4 years. He asked if she had a business partner, someone with farming background. She told him she had herself. Douglas Farwell signed the papers. He was professional about it. But when she walked out of that office into the October sun with the deed to the Halverson property in her hand, she heard him say something to his assistant in the hallway behind her. She didn't catch all the words. She caught enough. The Alvarez family ran the feed store in Camino, 6 miles from the orchard, and they were among the first people Maren asked for help. Not because she needed their approval, but because Luis Alvarez had been farming the El Dorado County foothills his entire life and knew the soil and the water and the particular personality of the Sierra Nevada's winter weather better than anyone she'd met. He was polite to her face. His wife, Concha, who worked the register, was warmer. But Maren saw the look that passed between them when she described her plan to rehabilitate 90 acres of abandoned heritage apples and press them into cider. "It's a lot of work for one person," Luis said. She told him she was aware of that. "Those old trees." He shook his head slowly. "Some of them maybe can't come back." She told him she'd assessed them herself and she believed most of them could. He nodded in a way that meant he didn't agree but was too kind to say so. The county extension agent was less kind. His name was Brent Holloway, and he came out to the property 6 weeks after Maren had taken possession, in a county truck with a clipboard, because she had applied for a small agriculture grant and a site visit was required. He walked the rows with her on a cold November morning, frost still white in the low spots, his boots crunching on the fallen leaves, and he made notes on his clipboard with the careful thoroughness of a man who has already reached his conclusions. He stood in the middle of what had been Cal Halverson's East Block, 40 trees of the Cox's orange pippin, showing the results of a decade of canker and fire blight, and he said that the trees were likely too far gone for commercial rehabilitation. He said the soil had compaction issues. He said the altitude and the specific frost pocket of that east-facing slope made it a marginal site for late-keeping apple varieties. He said all of these things in a voice that was patient and not unkind, but carried underneath it the particular certainty of a man who has spent 20 years telling people things they don't want to hear and has come to confuse that with wisdom. Then he wrote his assessment and mailed it to her. That was the letter with her name at the top, in the ink blue hand. Not recommended for grant funding at this time. Site viability concerns. Applicant lacks demonstrable agricultural experience. She'd read it so many times the creases had gone soft. She did not receive the grant. She spent her savings instead. Every dollar of the $43,000, and then a small business loan she secured on the value of the property itself, and then 2 years of income from weekend catering work she took on to bridge the gap. She hired one person, a young man named Tomas Reyes, who had just finished a year at Fresno State studying horticulture and needed summer work, and together, the two of them began the rehabilitation. The work in that first year was brutal. They pruned the Cox's orange pippins through February and into March, cutting back years of cross-growth, removing the dead wood, opening the canopy to light and air the way you open a room that's been shut too long. The fire blight had taken 7 of the 40 trees in the east block beyond saving, and those they removed with a chainsaw on a gray January morning, Maren making each cut herself, slowly, the way you do something that needs to be done but deserves to be done with attention. The stumps sat low in the wet grass for 3 seasons before she had the heart to grind them out. The Gravenstein block was in better shape. Gravensteins are tough, rangy trees, the kind of apple that wants to be a wild thing and will forgive a certain amount of neglect if you come back to it with honesty. She and Tomas pruned and sprayed and cleared and fed the soil with compost she had trucked in from a dairy operation and rescue, and by April of that first year, the Gravensteins were pushing new growth in a way that made her stand in the row on a Tuesday morning with her hand on a branch and just look at it for a long time. The heirloom seedling block was the mystery. 32 trees, planted in the 1950s, no variety name in any record she could find. The fruit was a deep burgundy red with a faint russeting over the shoulder, small, almost walnut-sized, and when she cut one open in September of that first year, a fruit she'd found still hanging on a tree she'd thought nearly dead, the flesh was cream-colored, dense, and the smell that came off the cut surface was something she had no immediate word for. Floral. Tannic. Like rose hips and something older, something almost fermented in itself, as if the apple was already reaching towards cider without any help from her. She took samples to a pomologist at UC Davis that November. He looked at the fruit and the leaves and the tree habit and told her he thought it might be related to a French crabapple rootstock that had naturalized over generations, but he wasn't certain. He was interested, though, in the way a scientist gets when something doesn't fit the existing catalog. He asked if he could have cuttings in the spring to propagate for study. She said yes, and drove home with the windows down in the cold November air, and the thought that was forming in her mind was still too fragile to speak out loud. But she was already imagining it. The way a cider made from those small dark apples might taste. The tannin structure. The acidity. The way they might balance the bright sharpness of the Gravensteins and the honeyed complexity of the Coxes. It was, she understood by then, going to take years. The neighbors were not cruel, mostly. There was a kind of cruelty in kindness sometimes, though, in the soft concern at the Camino Grange meetings, in the way people asked how the orchard was coming along with their heads tilted just slightly to one side. A woman farming alone at altitude on trees nobody else had wanted was either going to be a cautionary tale or a local curiosity, and in those early years, most people had placed their quiet bets on the former. One afternoon in her second summer, a neighboring rancher named Wade Cutler came by on his ATV and watched from the fence line for a while as Maren and Tomas thinned fruit in the Gravenstein block. Wade ran beef cattle on the land adjacent and had farmed there his whole life and had the particular authority that comes with that kind of tenure. He said nothing for a long time. Then he said it was a shame about those old trees and that he'd always figured when the Halverson place finally sold it'd go to grapes. Grapes would have made more sense up here, he said. There's wineries all up and down these hills. She kept working. I don't make wine. No, he said, and there was something in that one-syllable word that contained about 6 different meanings, none of them entirely flattering. He drove off. She watched the dust settle behind his ATV and went back to thinning fruit, moving down the row, her hands in the small cool apples, the summer light coming down hard through the canopy gaps. She did not explain herself to Wade Cutler. She had learned, by the second year, that explanation was beside the point. The orchard was the argument. Either it would make that argument or it wouldn't. By the third autumn, the Gravenstein block was producing real fruit. She pressed her first serious test batch, 40 gallons of juice from hand-picked Gravensteins run through a rented Racencloth press, and fermented it slowly through the winter in second-hand oak barrels she'd bought from a Napa winery that was switching to stainless. The first draw-off in February was sharp and bright and raw, nothing ready to serve anyone. But the second draw-off in April had a quality she hadn't been expecting, something that made her set down the wine thief and stand still in the cold of the barn for a moment. She called Tomas in. He tasted it from the same wine thief, standing with her in the barn in his work jacket, the two of them saying nothing for a moment. That's something, he said finally. She nodded. That's something. She bottled 12 cases and sold 11 of them to a restaurant in Placerville and one to a shop in Auburn that was beginning to carry local craft beverages. The restaurateur, a woman named Diane Sato who had known Maren slightly from her cooking years, tried the cider at her bar and called the next morning and asked for twice as much in the fall. This was not a triumph. Maren did not allow herself to treat it as one. 11 cases of cider was 11 cases. The orchard needed to be proven over years and seasons, not one good pressing. She had learned enough about fermentation to know that a single good batch was a promise, and a promise made by an apple tree to a first-time cider maker needed many more years of evidence before it meant anything. But she allowed herself, that spring evening, to sit on the porch steps of the old Halverson farmhouse with a glass of her own Gravenstein cider and watch the last light leave the ridgeline of the orchard and feel something quiet and solid in her chest. The trees were hers. The cider was hers. The $43,000 were gone and the loan was still considerable and the work was enormous and uncertain. But the trees were alive, and they were hers, and they were producing. She wrote down what she was tasting in a small notebook she kept for that purpose: bright green apple on the nose, almost Granny Smith sharpness on entry, then a mid-palate that opened into something rounder, faint vanilla from the oak, finish that was clean and long and faintly saline, like a sea breeze inland. She dated the entry. April 14th. She closed the notebook and watched the light go. The hard year came in year 4. A late frost on the 17th of April, she would remember the date with the precision of a wound, caught the orchard just as the Gravensteins and the Coxes were in full bloom. She'd been watching the forecast for a week, the numbers edging downward each night, and she had done what she could, run the overhead sprinklers she'd installed the previous fall to ice protect the blossoms, set smudge pots in the frost pockets, covered what she could cover. She was out in the orchard at 2 in the morning, moving between rows, checking the ice formation on the sprinkled trees, checking the smudge pots, moving through that strange suspended world of frozen smoke and ice-white blossoms in the dark. At 4 in the morning, the temperature dropped to 27 degrees and held there for 3 hours. She stood at the edge of the Gravenstein block in the pre-dawn and didn't move for a long time. The blossoms were brown-centered. Frozen through. The kill was not total, the iced-over trees had fared better, and a portion of the Coxes on the upper slope above the frost line had come through, but the Gravenstein crop for that year was largely gone, and with it the volume she needed to meet the commitments she'd made to 3 restaurants and the small cidery operation she'd started building in the old dairy barn. She went inside, made coffee, and sat at the table with her production notes and her loan payment schedule and did the arithmetic slowly and carefully, the way you do arithmetic when you already know the answer but need to write it down to be certain. She was short. The year was going to be short. She called Tomas that morning. He came and they walked the orchard together and assessed what was left, row by row, tree by tree, writing down the numbers. What was left of the Coxes on the high ground? The heirloom seedling block, which had come through better than anything, those trees, older and lower and apparently seasoned to the specific cold patterns of that hillside in some way she didn't fully understand, had held their blossoms with an almost stubborn resilience. She pressed the heirloom seedlings that fall for the first time. There had not been enough fruit in previous years, the rehabilitation of that block had been slower, more careful, requiring the removal of a whole generation of crossing water chutes before the trees could direct their energy into fruit. This was the first real harvest from the mystery apples, and it was modest, 3 tons, enough for perhaps 400 gallons of juice. She pressed it separately, kept it entirely separate from the other varieties, fermented it slowly in glass through the winter in the old dairy barn with the wood stove going just enough to keep the temperature from dropping below 50 degrees. And then she waited. She did the math on the reduced year. She told Diane Sato she could deliver less than half what she'd promised. Diane was gracious about it. The shop in Auburn understood. She cut costs everywhere she could cut them, deferred maintenance that could be deferred, and spent that winter not in depression but in a kind of focused quiet that felt like the opposite of despair. She worked on the heirloom fermentation. She read everything she could find about wild yeast populations in cider apples. She drove to a heritage cider festival in Sonoma County in November and stood at the edge of a seminar on tannic apple varieties listening to a British cider maker describe the specific quality that certain old varieties produced, a thing called farmyard character, and she felt something click into place in her understanding, something that had been turning slowly for years. The heirloom draw-off in February was unlike anything she had pressed before. She sat in the cold barn with a glass of it in both hands and her eyes closed and ran through what she was tasting with the same precision she'd used as a pastry chef to analyze a new flavor combination. The tannins were structural without being harsh, the kind of tannin that came from skin contact and time. The acidity was lower than the Gravensteins, softer, and there was a mid-palate quality. She wrote it in her notebook as dried wild rose and autumn wood smoke, faint earth, long mineral finish, that she had never found in a commercial cider and had only approached in 1 or 2 of the British farmhouse ciders she'd managed to source over the years. Those small dark apples, the origin unknown, the variety nameless, had been waiting in those trees for 50 years to become what they were. She named the variety herself. She called it the Halverson Burgundy, for the man who'd planted it, for the color of the skin. The name was private, for a while. Written in notebooks. Told to Tomas and to the UC Davis pomologist, who by that point had confirmed his hypothesis about the French rootstock ancestry and was planning a paper. She entered a bottle of the 2016 Halverson Burgundy single varietal cider in the California Cider Association's annual competition that spring. Amateur division, small production category. She mailed the entry form on a Tuesday morning in March, drove to the post office in Camino, stood at the counter and bought the stamps herself. She did not tell anyone she'd entered. She went home and fed the chickens and drove the tractor through the heirloom seedling block to check the soil moisture, and she did not wait. She went back to work, because the trees did not stop needing attention because she had mailed a form somewhere. She got an honorable mention. She read the results sheet twice, standing in the doorway of the barn in the late afternoon light. Honorable mention. Second runner-up in the small production heirloom category. She set the paper on the barn shelf between the temperature logs and went inside and cooked dinner, and she did not feel disappointed in a way that paralyzed her. She felt the information go into the same place all the other information had gone, into the working knowledge, into the understanding of what still needed to be refined. She pulled out her tasting notes from the entry bottle and found 3 things she knew had been slightly off. The sulfite level had been too high. The bottle conditioning had added a faint yeasty quality on the finish that muddied the mineral character she was reaching for. The harvest date had been perhaps 4 days too early on the heirloom block. She had been watching bricks levels but had not waited quite long enough for the tannins to fully polymerize. She wrote all 3 things down and dated the page. The following spring, the 2016 California wildfires sent ash columns over the Sierra Nevada foothills that turned the late summer light amber and coated the orchard with a fine gray-white powder for 3 weeks in August and September. Her neighbors were watching their properties for ember fall. The air quality index ran in the unhealthy range for weeks. She wore a respirator while she worked, moving through the rows with her monitoring equipment, checking the fruit. The ash, she knew, would affect pH in the fermentation. It would change the mineral character of the water she used. She adjusted. She made notes. She pushed the harvest date back by 5 days to compensate for reduced photosynthesis and extended hang time. In October, she and Tomas picked the heirloom block by hand over 3 days, each apple assessed individually before it went into the picking bin, the cull set aside, the best fruit preserved with a care that the commercial growers down the hill would have considered economically irrational. She pressed in November. Fermented slowly. The 2017 vintage of the Halverson Burgundy was everything the 2016 had been with the 3 corrections applied, and when she drew the first sample in March of 2018, standing in the barn with the gray-white light of a cloudy morning coming through the high windows, she set down the wine thief and looked at the glass for a long moment. Then she called Tomas. He drove up from Placerville in 40 minutes. He tasted it, standing in the same spot she'd been standing. He looked up at her. "You need to enter this," he said. She already knew she was going to. She entered 2 competitions that fall with the 2017 Halverson Burgundy. The first was the California State Fair Commercial Beverage Competition, where she received a silver medal in the Heritage Cider category and a judge's note that described the cider as extraordinary in structure, highly unusual varietal expression, minor oxidation issue on the finish. She fixed the oxidation issue. She filed down the minor flaw with the same patience she'd used to file down every other flaw for 7 years, and she bottled the adjusted lot with care. The second competition was the Good Food Awards, held in San Francisco in January of 2019. She drove down from Camino in the dark on a January morning in a coat she'd had since her cooking years, with the box of bottles wrapped in moving blankets on the back seat of the same truck with the cracked windshield and 214,000 miles on it now. The ceremony was held at the Ferry Building, and she stood in the crowd of cheesemakers and bakers and picklers and farmers and felt, for the first time in several years, slightly out of her element, not on her own land, not in the known rhythms of the orchard, but in a room full of people who had found their way to the same belief she had, that a thing made slowly from the right materials in the right place could carry a particular truth in it that no amount of marketing or scaling could manufacture. She did not win that one. She received an honorable mention and a conversation with a beverage buyer from a specialty food distributor in the Bay Area who tasted her cider at the table and asked, carefully, about her production volume. She told him honestly. He nodded, slowly, the way someone nods when they're converting numbers into something they want to ask further about. He gave her his card. The Sacramento run happened in September of 2019. She'd entered the California Cider Association's commercial competition. She had a commercial license now, small production, Halverson Orchard Cidery, registered with the state in 2018, in 3 categories: the single varietal heritage category, the blended farmhouse category, and the experimental category. The blended was a combination of her Halverson Burgundy and the Gravenstein, a proportion she'd worked out over 2 seasons to balance the tannin and the acid in a way that was more approachable than the single varietal without losing what made the Burgundy distinct. The experimental was a still, unfined version of the Halverson Burgundy that she'd aged in a used bourbon barrel for 8 months. She made the drive to Sacramento alone. She checked in at the registration table alone. She sat in the back of the room during the awards and held both hands folded in her lap, not because she was nervous but because she was tired, a clean, deep, specific exhaustion, the kind that comes from having given everything to a thing over a long time and being close to the moment when you find out if the thing received what you gave it. The blended farmhouse cider received a bronze. She wrote it in her notebook. The experimental Halverson Burgundy in bourbon barrel received a silver and a special judge's commendation for distinctive terroir expression and exceptional tannic structure. She wrote that down. And then the single varietal heritage category. The category chair was a woman who ran a cidery in Sebastopol. She read the placements in reverse order: 3rd place, 2nd place, and then she paused before reading the 1st place, the way people pause when they want what they're about to say to land properly, and she said, 1st place and the gold medal in the single varietal heritage category goes to the 2017 Halverson Burgundy, from Halverson Orchard Cidery, Dorado County. Maren wrote it in her notebook. Gold. She wrote the date, September 14, 2019. Then she walked forward to collect the medal and shook the hand of the category chair and went back to her seat and sat with the medal in her closed hand and did not cry. She had thought she might cry, had made a quiet private bet with herself that she would. She did not. Her eyes were dry and her breathing was slow, and what she felt was not what she'd expected to feel. She had expected relief. Or triumph. She had expected some release of the long pressure. What she felt instead was something quieter and more complete. Like a conversation that had been going on for 7 years had just reached its natural end, all the sentences finally said, and now there was a pause, not empty, but full, the way a field is full after a long rain. She drove home in the dark. The medal was in her coat pocket, pressed against her ribs, the whole 5 hours up from Sacramento to Camino. And when she turned off the highway onto the county road and then onto her own gravel drive, the headlights swept across the front rows of the Halverson Burgundy block and she stopped the truck and sat there with the engine running for a while, looking at the trees in the headlights. Dark now, and cold, and stripped of most of their leaves, the branches showing their shapes against the October sky, the particular architecture of trees that had been correctly pruned for years and were growing in the specific way they needed to grow, with air and light in all the right places. She went inside and found the letter on the table. She had not placed it there herself, she never left it anywhere but the box in the bedroom where she kept the documents from those early years, the loan papers, the grant rejection, the county assessor's correspondence. But it was on the kitchen table, and later she would wonder if she'd taken it out that morning without thinking, the way you carry things from room to room without noticing, the way the body makes its own arrangements for what the day is going to need. She smoothed it flat with both hands. The coffee she'd left in the pot that morning was cold, and she didn't bother heating it. She just sat there in the kitchen at 4 o'clock in the morning with the letter and the medal and the gray light beginning at the window. Not recommended for grant funding at this time. Site viability concerns. Applicant lacks demonstrable agricultural experience. She thought about Brent Holloway, the extension agent with his clipboard and his careful voice. She did not feel anger, exactly. She had not felt anger about him in a long time. What she had felt, in the years since that assessment, was something more like a private ongoing conversation, a low-voiced argument she had been conducting with every pruning cut, every harvest decision, every adjustment to the fermentation protocol. Not against him, specifically. Against the idea that a person without a credential, without a male partner, without an existing agricultural lineage, without the kind of resume that fits inside a checkbox on a grant form, the idea that such a person ought to be manageable, discouraged, redirected towards something more realistic. She knew what realistic looked like. She'd been looking at it for 7 years, 90 acres of rehabilitated orchard, 3 gold and silver medals on the shelf in the cidery, a 2-year waiting list with the distributor from San Francisco, and 32 trees of a variety that didn't have a name when she found it and that now had cuttings growing at UC Davis and at 2 university research stations. The Halverson Burgundy. Cal Halverson had planted it without knowing what he had. The trees had survived 11 years of abandonment and 1 severe late frost and a wildfire ash fall and 7 years of Maren Calloway's learning. They had come through all of that and made something that a room full of people in Sacramento had called the best single varietal heritage cider in California. She folded the letter back into thirds, along the old creases, the soft worn creases it had learned over 22 years of being opened and read and refolded. She held it in both hands for a moment, the way you hold something you've been arguing with for a long time when the argument is finally finished. She thought about Luis Alvarez at the feed store, who had started coming to the cidery's open harvest weekends 3 years ago with Concha and their 2 grandchildren, and who had shaken her hand last October with a grip that held something in it, some acknowledgement that didn't need words. She thought about Tomas, who was 29 now and had been her right hand through all 7 harvests and who was, she had decided last spring, going to have his name added to the label of the blended cider beginning with the 2020 vintage. She thought about Diane Sato, who had never once doubted the cider and who had introduced her to 3 other restaurateurs who hadn't either. She thought about the late frost at 2 in the morning, herself moving through the dark orchard with the smudge pots and the sprinklers going, the blossoms lit white in the porch light, ice beginning to form on the petals, the temperature dropping. She thought about that. She got up and went to the window. Dawn was coming over the ridgeline now, the thin pre-light that arrives before the sun, when the sky goes from black to a dark blue to a gray that is almost green, and the shapes of the trees begin to find themselves out of the darkness one by one. The Halverson Burgundy block was closest to the house, and she could see the outer row from the window, the dark shapes of the trees in the early light, the last few leaves still hanging amber and rust on the uppermost branches. Tomas was coming at 7 to begin the late-season cleanup. There was work to do. The cover crop needed to be mowed between the rows before the first hard freeze, the irrigation system needed to be drained and winterized, the barrel room needed the temperature checked and the final adjustments made on the last lot of 2019 Gravenstein Burgundy blend before she committed it to bottle. She put on the coffee. The old percolator, the one that had come with the farmhouse and that she'd replaced twice and then given up on replacing because the percolator made better coffee. She listened to it begin its work, the first soft sounds of water heating, the tick and settle of the old stove. She picked up the letter. She walked to the wood stove in the corner of the kitchen, the cast iron one, the Vermont castings model she'd bought used the first winter, that had heated this kitchen through 7 winters now, and she opened the firebox door. The coals from last night were still there, orange-red under gray ash, not dead. She set the letter on the coals. She watched it catch, the edges going brown and then curling black, the ink-blue words disappearing in the particular order that fire chooses, not the order she would have chosen. The signature went first. Then the body of the assessment. The last thing to go was the heading, her name, typed, with the county seal. She closed the firebox door. She stood there for a moment with her hand on the warm iron of the stove, the coffee beginning to smell right behind her, and outside the window the orchard was coming into the first real light of morning, the Halverson Burgundy trees taking on their color, the last amber leaves bright against the October sky. There was work to do. She put on her boots. She picked up her coffee when it was ready, took one long sip standing at the counter, and went outside. The gravel of the drive was cold under her boots, the frost not yet melted in the low spots between the rows, and the air smelled of apple wood and cold soil and the faint distant smoke of someone's morning fire down the valley. She walked to the edge of the heirloom block and stopped there, the way she always stopped at that spot, the way she had stopped there for 7 years at the beginning of every working day. The trees were old and they were hers and they were still. She set her coffee mug on the top rail of the fence post, the old wooden post that Cal Halverson had set in the ground 60 years before she ever laid eyes on this land, and she looked down the row of the Halverson burgundy trees in the early light. Their bark was dark and furrowed the way old apple bark gets, and the branches held their shape against the sky with the particular confidence of things that have been properly tended and know it. 3 or 4 fruit had been missed in the harvest and were still hanging, small and dark red and beginning to wrinkle with the cold, the way the last fruit always looks, not failed but finished. The gold medal was in her coat pocket. She hadn't moved it since Sacramento. She set her hand flat against the bark of the nearest tree, the first tree in the first row, the tree she had always started at when she walked the block. The bark was cold and rough under her palm, and she held it there for a moment the way she had held the letter, the way you hold something when the holding itself is the thing you want to do, before any words come. 60 years ago, Cal Halverson had pushed a scion into a rootstock somewhere on this hillside and walked away from it without knowing what he'd made. 11 years after that, the trees had sat alone and untended and unvalued, and the wild things had grown up between them, and still they had kept putting out root and leaf and blossom and fruit in the particular patient way that apple trees hold to their nature when everything else has abandoned them. And then she had come. Not because anyone told her to. Not because a grant form said it was viable or a county agent said it was recommended or a neighbor thought it made sense. She had come because she had stood at the fence line years before and seen something alive where other people saw only what was dead, and she had trusted that seeing more than she trusted anyone else's assessment of the evidence. That was the whole of it, when you reduced it to its simplest form. That was the story in one sentence, and she'd been living it for 7 years without needing to say it out loud. The sun was clearing the ridgeline now. It came across the orchard from the east in long flat rays that lit the dew on the cover crop between the rows, turning it briefly silver, and the amber leaves of the Halverson burgundy trees caught the light and held it, and for a moment the whole block was gold. She heard Tomas's truck coming up the drive. She picked up her coffee mug from the fence post, took a long sip, hot now, the way she needed it, and turned to meet the day. The orchard behind her, lit and quiet and full of everything it had taken to earn this morning. The gold medal warm in her left pocket. The wood stove at the farmhouse catching on something that was no longer there to burn. And the trees, old, dark-barked, unshowy, unpublicized, holding their few last red fruits against the cold blue sky above Dorado County, making no argument. Asking for nothing. Simply, after all this time, still here. If this story stayed with you, the quiet ones usually do, share it tonight with someone who has been told that what they're building isn't viable, isn't recommended, ISN.